Subscribe for more true crime videos. In today's video, we will be discussing the case of Betty Broderick. Elizabeth Ann Segula, better known as Betty, met Daniel Thomas Broderick III in 1965. The couple was married on April the 12th of 1969. 9 months later, their first child, Kim, was born on January the 24th of 1970. Betty was pregnant 9 times, would give birth 5 times, one of which was a premature birth, and the baby passed away, 2 miscarriages and 2 abortions.
Decision maker. And I was happy to finally be married. I wanted to be married very much all my life, and I was looking forward to cooking and fixing up the house and cleaning and having children.
Betty graduated from the College of Mount St. Vincent in the Bronx, where she obtained her degree in early childhood education. After Dan graduated from Cornell Medical School, he decided to attend Harvard Law. Betty was the main provider for the family. She worked as a teacher, took care of children in her home, sold Avon and Tupperware to put Dan through Harvard Law. Dan earned his law degree from Harvard Law, and he began his career as a medical malpractice attorney. He accepted a job at the law office of Gray Carey in San Diego. 5 years later, he opened his own law firm. Dan's law firm took off. He started receiving large settlements, and the money began rolling in, so to say. Dan called himself Count de Money, and he got a nose job. The family was well on their way to the life of their dreams: a country club membership, a ski condo in Colorado, and an unlimited shopping budget. With Dan's law firm taking off, Betty could now focus on being a full-time mother and wife, which was what she loved doing the most. Financially, they were well off, but their marriage was full of turmoil and was beginning to crumble.
Believe that there was ever a time that either one of them thought that their marriage was a marriage made in heaven.
Betty would oftentimes threaten divorce. Dan worked long hours as an attorney. Dan and Betty fought often, sometimes violently. Betty threw a ketchup bottle, a stereo, and even locked him out of the house and burned his clothes. Kim testified to these things in her mother's second trial in 1991.
And what would she say?
She'd say, your father and I are going to get a divorce. Who do you want to live with?
Can you describe that?
That usually happened if Dad would go out after work, and then Mom would lock the door. And then he would either, they had a balcony outside their bedroom, so he would either go up there and somehow get in, or one time I think he knocked the door down. And then another time he slept in the garage.
So this was something that happened on more than one occasion?
Yeah, it happened quite a few times.
Would he ever call up to you to have you let him in the house?
Yes.
Do you remember ever a time when your mother actually kicked him out of the house for an extended period of time?
Yes, he moved out into a hotel in La Jolla for a while. Not more than a month, but I think like a week or so.
Was this, do you recall, was this when he was still working for the firm of Gray Carey?
Yes.
And do you recall what his reaction was when your mother told him to leave?
He didn't want to go.
What did he say?
He said he'd be back soon and it'll be okay. And no, he didn't want to go at all. At each other?
Yes. Did your mother ever do anything violent towards your father?
I never saw her hit him, but she would scratch him and stick her fingernails in his arm. But I didn't see her hit him.
What was that when she would, you indicated sticking her fingernails in his arm. Was that something that happened just on occasion, or did it happen often?
It happened pretty often when we were young. And I know that she scratched his back once. I saw that, that's all.
Were there ever any incidents where she threw anything at him?
Yes.
Can you describe?
One night at dinner, he came in late, and, well, I don't know if that was the whole issue, but she threw a ketchup bottle at him across the table. And then one time, we went to dinner, and we got back, and, well, we went out for pizza, and we got back, and she threw a stereo, and then she threw this thing, this marble thing that has this little, I think you grind something in it or something. She threw that. And that's pretty much all she threw.
The incident where she threw the ketchup bottle, do you recall how he responded to that? Did he throw anything back at her, or was there a fight?
No, no, it just smashed on the wall. And that was about all for that.
And the time that you went out for pizza with your dad, who else was at this pizza?
Dave Monahan and his children.
Okay, can you tell us who David Monahan is?
He's a friend of my father's.
So your dad, you and your
Sister.
and David Monahan and his children, you all went out for pizza together.
Right.
And then what happened when you got home?
We were late, and then she threw a stereo. When we walked in the door, she threw the stereo, and then she threw the marble thing.
Can you describe how she went about doing that?
The room overlooks the backyard, and she went in and took all the clothes and threw them out the back over the balcony into the grass. And then she dumped the drawers out, and then she went down and put gasoline all over the place and lit it on fire. And then she poured black paint all over the rest of it. Maybe she poured the black paint on to put this fire out. But after the fire, then there was black paint all over everything else. It wasn't burned.
When she was doing this, when she was throwing the clothes off the balcony onto the ground, were you there?
Yes.
Okay. And what were you doing?
Asking her to stop doing that.
Okay. Were you upset at what she was doing?
Yes.
Were you crying?
Yes.
And what was her response to you when you were trying to get her to stop?
She sent me away and hit me and told me to go away. And then I went away. So I wasn't there after the fire started.
What, were you aware of the fact that the fire started?
Yeah, the whole neighborhood was at my house.
Do you recall what you did?
Left.
Left?
Down, yeah. Walked down the street and down the hill.
Were you upset at the time?
Yeah, very upset.
What about, do you know where your sister or your brothers were at the time?
They were across the street at the McKelson's house. Those were our next door neighbors.
About?
Yes, about a ring that he gave her.
Can you describe what happened?
She wanted this emerald ring that she's been eyeing for a long time. She really wanted it. And then he went and got her a ring, but it wasn't the ring that she wanted. So she said it was a disgrace and that she wasn't going to wear this, and it was like a child's ring, and then she threw it.
When you say she threw it, what did she do with it?
She opened it, and then she got mad about it, and then she threw the ring.
What did you see the ring? What kind of ring was it that he gave to her?
It was an emerald ring.
It wasn't the one that she had requested?
Right.
In the fall of 1982, Dan hired former Delta Airlines flight attendant Linda Kokina, age 21, to be his legal assistant. Dan and Betty's marriage went from bad to worse. On Dan's 39th birthday, Betty went to his office to surprise him and salvage a crumbling marriage. Betty ended up being the one who was surprised. The receptionist told her that Linda and Dan were out to lunch. She went to his office and found the remains of a party. Betty waited for Dan in his office until later that evening. He never returned. She left his office in a rage. She burned his clothes that evening and told Dan to get rid of Linda or get out. Betty began to suspect that Dan was having an affair with Linda. Dan denied this affair, called her crazy. Dan moved out in February of 1985. After Dan left, Betty went from rage to fury. Thinking he would have more respect for her and come home, Betty dropped her children off at their father's house, screaming and crying. Betty busted a window in the Coral Reef house with an umbrella, spray painted his bedroom, smeared a cream pie on his bed, and destroyed furniture and Dan's crystal. Dan filed for divorce in 1985. In the article, Till Murder Do Us Part, Dan and Betty Broderick's divorce played out over 5 vicious years by Amy Wallace. Quote, Dan filed for divorce, sparking 5 years of battles so violent that Broderick versus Broderick became known as the worst divorce in San Diego County. The jilted wife spray painted the interior of the $325,000 hillside home they shared. Dan filed a restraining order against Betty, but she continued to enter Dan's home without Dan being there. Dan bought a home in Marston Hills and bought Betty a Ocean View estate in La Jolla. Dan needed to sell the Coral Reef home. According to the book Hell Hath No Fury, a true story of wealth and passion, love and envy, and a woman driven to the ultimate rage by Byron Tombaman. Sorry if I'm not pronouncing that correctly. Betty's attorney, Daniel Jaff, said he remembered Betty being annoyed and complaining in regards to the sale price of the home. Betty rejected both offers. Dan had an emergency court order allowing him to sell the home. Betty said she was unaware of this court proceeding. Betty received a phone call from her attorney later that evening while she was having dinner with friends. Her attorney told her that Daniel had sold the home. Betty was furious. She went to Dan's home in Marston Hills. Kim testified in court that her mother drove to her father's house, even though there was a restraining order against her. She waited on Dan to show up. When Dan got home, he immediately ordered her off his property and gave her 10 minutes to leave, and told her to call her attorney. Betty, in a rage and fury, drove to the Coral Reef home and smashed a glass door and poured gas on the steps and lit a match in an attempt to stop the sale of the Coral Reef home. The fire only caused minimal damage. She drove back to Dan's Marston Hills home and drove her Chevy Suburban through his front door. After a violent scuffle, Betty was hauled off in a straitjacket. Betty also left vulgar and obscene messages on Dan's answering machine, referring to Linda as the whore and the cunt, threatening to kill Dan, and arguing with their son, Danny.
Both are separated, Mom. And he likes somebody else now. He doesn't like you anymore. And I mean, if you gotta stop saying the bad words. Why doesn't he like me anymore? Because he's sick of you. Because you guys get in all these fights. Why do we get in fights? I don't know. Because he was secretary. Even before that, you got in fights, Mom. I don't think so, Danny. See, you didn't know he was secretary for the last 2 years we were married. We want to live with you, but you're just making it harder for all of us that wants to live over there. If you stop saying bad words, everybody will be happier. At least I know I will. I have very important things to ask you. You're making me mad. I'll kill you. This is a message to Head and the You have one hell of a nerve dumping the kids here on the sidewalk and zooming away without making any attempt to communicate with me about my plans for the weekend. Come get the kids. I want to get rid of them, but I don't like driving to your neighborhood. Hurry up and come get them. Asshole.
Dan let Betty know that he would be fining her for her messages and he would deduct $100 per offensive word, and that deduction would be taken from Betty's support checks. He also fined her for unannounced visits and trespassing. 1 month, Betty was $1,300 in debt due to her fines. In July of 1986, Dan was granted a divorce and sole custody of the children. Betty was granted temporary support until the final settlement was made. After 2 years of settlement negotiations, Dan and Betty went before a judge in December of 1988. Betty represented herself, claiming she could not find a lawyer due to Dan being the president of the San Diego Bar Association. Betty received $16,000 a month in support until she remarried and custody of their 17-year-old daughter, Lee. Betty was outraged. She claimed she deserved a much better settlement. A few weeks later, Betty bought a 5-shot Smith & Wesson .38 caliber revolver and filled it with hollow point bullets. Hollow point bullets are used because they penetrate targets but also expand. They stay inside soft tissues. They usually punch straight through soft tissues, and the bullet will mushroom in the soft tissue, causing more internal damage. That is why Betty used these bullets to cause the most damage when Betty murdered Dan and Linda. I believe the purchase of the gun showed premeditation on Betty's part. On April 22nd of 1989, Dan and Linda were married. Dan hired guards due to Betty's threats to kill him, and his family and friends wanted him to wear a bulletproof vest, but he didn't want to live his life that way. Betty's friend spent the day with her and would make them aware if she tried to sneak over and attend. Betty was anxious and angry. Linda noticed books missing from her bedside table. Linda told a friend that one night, by showing up in their house, Betty scared her, quote, scared the hell out of her. Dan had changed the locks and told the children to guard the keys with their lives. Dan and Linda were afraid of Betty. Before Halloween in 1989, Kim had lost the keys to her father's home. Her mother even helped her search for the keys. In the last weeks before their murders, Dan was considering giving Betty conditional visitation of the children. According to a LA Times article written by Amy Wallace, quote, on the first Friday in November 1989, 4 days before Betty's 42nd birthday, yet another round of legal papers arrived at her door. Dan was threatening to file criminal contempt charges unless she stopped leaving lewd messages on the answering machine he shared with his new wife, Linda. Betty was livid. That was her final straw. Betty awoke in the early morning hours of November 5th, 1989. She drove to Dan and Linda's house, opened the back door with her daughter Kim's keys. She knew the layout of the house well, where she had barged in before. She silently crept up the stairs and entered Dan and Linda's bedroom while they slept. She fired the gun 5 times into their sleeping bodies, shot Linda in the head and chest, and shot Dan in the back, leaving him wounded in the floor. She pulled the phone out of the wall. Dan's last words was, "Okay, you got me. I'm dead." Betty rushed out of the house. Betty made a few phone calls after shooting Dan and Linda. She called her daughters Lee and Kim, telling them that she didn't think they were dead and she couldn't let them win. One of them had to die, and she showed no remorse.
It was quiet at Dan Broderick's Hillcrest home this morning. The police activity an indication of something less than tranquil inside. In fact, in their upstairs bedroom, Broderick, 44, and his 28-year-old second wife, Linda, lay shot to death. Friends apparently got a call in the early hours of the morning that something was wrong. Those friends got in through a window and found the bodies. Police got a call soon after. The police say Broderick's ex-wife may have made both phone calls.
We have an all-units broadcast for Elizabeth Ann Broderick, who we believe is his ex-wife. We believe she has some information that might bear on this case.
Broderick may have been successful in his professional life, but his personal life was filled with turmoil. He and his first wife, Betsy, had a bitter divorce, bitter custody battles. In fact, at one point, she drove her car up his walk and into his house. Broderick's children were apparently at their mother's La Jolla home when the shootings took place. Police talked with them today, but by mid-afternoon, their mother was still nowhere to be found. Dan Broderick made a mark, and a significant one, in the legal community in San Diego. His friends and colleagues are horrified.
He was a lawyer, a great lawyer, a doctor, graduated medical school. He's just a wonderful person. And it's just real sad. It's incredible that the number of people that will be hurt, just not just friends, but he's got 4 really wonderful kids.
But very nice, very quiet people. My son played with their children. It's a tragedy.
Dan and Linda Broderick had only been married a short time. They got married at this house, the same place where they were found shot to death.
Betty would turn herself in later that day. She would have 2 trials. The first trial began on October 22nd of 1990, almost a year later. Prosecutor Carrie Wells and her attorney Jack Early. This trial ended in a hung jury. One juror saying, "What took her so long?" Betty claimed she was the victim of years of abuse by her ex-husband Dan, who called her old, fat, boring, and stupid. Her second trial started a year later. Betty was found guilty of second-degree murder and sentenced to 32 years to life in prison. Through the years, Betty has shown no remorse and still claims she was abused. There have been 2 parole hearings, one in 2010 and one in 2017, and she was denied parole on both of those hearings because of her lack of remorse and still claiming she is the victim. Her children are divided on her being released. Kim and Danny don't want their mother released, while Lee and Rhett would like their mother to be released. Betty is a narcissistic psychopath. She showed all these traits through her actions, locking Dan out of the house, burning his clothes, and using her children as an attempt to get revenge against Dan. Betty claimed she went over to Dan and Linda's house to kill herself in front of them if they didn't want to talk to her. It's been said that Linda and Dan had an affair, and then it's been said they didn't. No one deserves to be murdered in their own bed while sleeping. Dan was described as a brilliant, hard-driven attorney. Linda was described as a kind, generous, and always there, giving a light and a joy. Dan and Linda were planning a family. Linda never got that chance. Your thoughts? Leave them in the comments below. Thank you for watching.